Hey, welcome to the Healthcare Nation podcast, episode 9. And I'm your host, Rick Janata. Very excited to be here. Why? Because we're going to be discussing leadership, culture, and communication. And I couldn't think of a better guest than to have Jaclyn Beck on the show. A little bit about Jaclyn professionally. From the business side, she has decades of experience working on Wall Street. And that experience spans the investment side, capital raising, fund management, both domestically and abroad. But she's also passionate about the power of self-awareness, emotional intelligence, and communication to promote career satisfaction and fulfillment at work. And in that sense, she's also taken that to her own consulting firm, Jaclyn Beck Consulting, where she works as a certified executive and career coach to really help individuals, startups, leaders, organizations across the board to really achieve their best. So with that, really happy to have Jaclyn on the show. Welcome, Jaclyn. I am so pleased to have you on the show today. I've been looking forward to this episode, really unpacking, I think, the most important aspects of everything that goes into the workplace environment, and that's relationships. And in healthcare, as you know, it's a loaded proposition. So I want to unpack that a little bit as well. But before we get started with really the questions I have, tell the audience a little bit about yourself, your journey, and I think the areas of focus that you're so passionate about.
Sure. Well, first of all, Rick, I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for having me on the show. I was very fortunate to have you as a guest on mine and very excited to continue the conversation. By way of introduction, my name is Jaclyn Beck. I am a certified executive leadership and business coach. I have a consulting company called Jaclyn Beck Consulting, where I effectively do two things. I help small businesses run more efficiently and effectively, help them institutionalize, help them scale. And I work with people to be more effective. So career, leadership, and executive coaching. And my journey to get where I am, when I really take a step back and reflect on it, I think started from a very young age. I like to joke, I was always the good girl growing up. I did everything that was expected of me. I was very fortunate to have loving and supportive parents, very fortunate to be given a tremendous amount of opportunity. And that was not lost on me. I didn't want to squander it. So I had, familial, societal self-expectation of myself to succeed, whatever this amorphous idea of success was. And at the time, success very much to me was make a lot of money, go to Wall Street, get a big job, become powerful. And so I went down this path that I've now called career autopilot, where I did well in school. I got a good SAT score. I went to a good college, university, got the great internship, got a full-time position on Wall Street. And my Wall Street story is a little different than the trope that's typically told. I was very fortunate that I was in an incredibly supportive environment where I worked with really great people who gave me a tremendous amount of opportunity. And so I was at a very big bank doing real estate private equity, and I got to wear a lot of hats on that journey. I got to buy buildings on behalf of pension funds. So apartment buildings, office buildings, industrial warehouses, shopping centers, and malls. So I would underwrite them and close them. I got to manage them and oversee them. I lived in London for a little bit and got to do a stint there on some of their more high-risk opportunistic deals. Then matriculated over to capital raising. So went out and sold our funds to our investors. And then finally did a stint in fund management where I was overseeing 2 different pools of capital. But what stands out to me about my career journey is I always had my day job. I always had my job description, but I've always been a squeaky wheel, and I've always had an eye toward problem solving. And so I was the 22, 23-year-old going to the head of X saying, we don't train very well. And they'd say, all right, we'll go build a program. Why not? She's willing to do it. She's relatively cheap labor. Let her go do it. And I would do it. Or we need more structure around our hiring. All right, Jackie, go do it. And I did. And that evolved into always looking for ways to improve the organization. And it always came back to people. And what I found, it was a very hierarchical, very structured organization. the higher up I went, the more I got promoted, the more pigeonholed I had to be. And what I learned about myself is I was very passionate about two things: strategy and people. And the more senior I got, the further away I got from certainly the people side, but even the strategy side, because at a lot of these bigger bureaucratic organizations, strategy is really dictated by a very small group of people. And sometimes it comes from the top and then it's just a directive. And so that ultimately led me to pursue my accreditation through the International Coaching Federation and launch my own business. And that is how I got where I am.
Fantastic. Wonderful journey and story, and one that has not ended. I should say that. I think we many chapters to come. You've hit on so many important things. I want to frame this up for healthcare, but I also want to go back to some of, we'll use business as an analog, but let's park that for now. I think about healthcare, and the stakes are so incredibly high because each encounter with the patient, the high relational component, each handoff to another staff member, communication, compliance with the protocol, they all have such significant consequence if they're not followed, right? If they're not executed on properly, if there's anything lost in translation, for lack of a better word. And as a high reliability organization, hospitals, one small mistake could have catastrophic, exponential impact on clearly patients we serve, but also systems, processes, and you could miss things, and that's problematic. Also, I would say this, and I think that it's out there. Burnout is at an all-time high.
Yes.
Particularly, I think, at the front lines in healthcare, at the caregivers. The pandemic has stretched clinical staff terribly thin, and I think the trust in leaders in the institutions has been impacted as well because of the response to that. And on that note, I really want to start at the top because it touches upon some of, I think, what you were hinting at, and more than hinting at, when it came to the strategy and also your communication and the ability to have your voice heard when it comes to, executing on strategy and just being at the table. When I think of the top and I think about leadership, we always hear that culture eats strategy. And I don't know if that's true. I've always thought that leadership kind of sets the strategy, which should clearly set the tone for culture. It is in one ways the positive side of the way we do things here. But I wanted to start at the top with you in that C-suite and kind of unpack that a bit.
Yeah, sure. And before we dig into that, it's very funny you make the distinction between healthcare and, business being an analog, because yes, we can use business as an analog, but I recall I was very junior. I was an analyst and I was turning in an underwriting. So the financial analysis for a building we were working on. And I was all worked up and nervous about it. And my boss turned to me at the time and she said, "This isn't brain surgery. This isn't life or death." And so that is the distinction between business and healthcare, because everything in healthcare is fundamentally higher stakes because it can be life or death. And so segueing to your question, that almost means that leadership and being thoughtful and intentional around strategy and around culture is much higher stakes in those organizations as well, because of the impact that it has throughout an organization, which you well know has a ripple effect. And so regarding your question about culture, first of all, words are porous. They mean different things to different people. When people say culture, I like to think of it as a system of behaviors and patterns where people operate with a common understanding. So to me, culture is really a triad that comes down to three things. And those three things are clarity, communication, and relationships. Yeah, and you hinted at that before. So from a clarity perspective, it's what is our goal? What is our vision? Where do we want to go? What is my message? And then what is at the heart of everything that we're doing here? What is the intrinsic motivator behind this, right? It's really understanding not only the people in an organization, but the organization itself, because the organization is an entity with a value system, with a purpose, with a mission, with a vision, right? So that's clarity. Then you go to communication. Communication is how do we relay that message? That could be to stakeholders within the C-suite. And we all know people who interact differently with different people, right? And have their own quirks. That could be communicating throughout an organization, whether it's an initiative. It could be communicating to key stakeholders outside of the organization, i.e. clients, i.e. patients, i.e. healthcare providers, et cetera, partners. And it really comes down to how am I delivering my message in a way that my receiver understands, and understanding that different audiences require different messaging because everyone has their own opinion, everyone has their own agenda, and everyone is going to be affected in their own way. And then finally, relationships. I always say relationships are the beating heart of all business. I would imagine you would agree that it's the beating heart of healthcare as well. I've heard you say it. And I think I shared this with you, but my grandfather was an internist and would take me on rounds with him in the hospital. And it's an incredibly intimate relationship between a healthcare provider and a patient, especially when life or death or health or non-health is on the line. And so there's an element of emotional intelligence and empathy that fundamentally goes into that it's so many organizations focusing on the bottom line, focusing on the profit. Well, look, I grew up on Wall Street. I am not discounting the importance of that, but there also needs to be an acknowledgement of the fact that these are humans. These are people who are within an organization. So those three pieces of the triad, I think, is what really drives culture forward. And when I think of strategy, to your question, and leadership being responsible for strategy, that to me is the clarity piece. Where are we going? Where do we want to go? I also think it's incumbent on leadership to really nail down the communication piece and really nail down the relationship piece. And because it's higher stakes, it's even more important in the healthcare industry.
Yeah, excellent points. And I think about the constituents communicating, obviously internal staff, employees, et cetera, but also the external audience in your community, which in many cases, certainly in the health sector, when you look at the provider side, hospitals, clinicians, they have a big place in the community's trust to be everything from the source of not only clinical care, but the expert voice, where folks would go to for answers. So it's so important that communication is crystal clear. I want to get back to a couple things, though, that you were talking about, which brings me to the point of walking the walk and what happens when the core values of an institution are not reconciling with practice. I'll characterize it that way. Let's just say across the board, but also specifically when leadership is not demonstrating, communicating, or in any way supporting or advancing their mission. And I could think of, obviously there's examples in business right now. Arguably, you could look at the mission statements of Facebook and Twitter and argue whether their leadership is fully in alignment with their mission statement. But I don't want to go down that road. I'm just thinking in general terms.
Yeah, and that's a great question. My personal philosophy is that it is incumbent on leadership to lead by example. Now, that's easy to say, just like it's easy to say clarity, communication, relationships. Of course, as humans, we overcomplicate things that are fundamentally at their core easy, right? But what I feel compelled to say, number one, is that I do think a lot of leaders and organizations take for granted the simple exercise of clarifying the values, clarifying the mission, clarifying the goals, clarifying the vision. And I do think there's a false perception that might be a little foofy or non-important. I think that is a critical step in any organization because it's about identity. And just like an individual can go through their career and learn who they are, organizations, even more so, need to be incredibly clear about who they are, because that is how they present themselves to their constituents. That's how they present themselves to their clients or their patients who ultimately bring in the revenue, right? It's a business. It's how they present themselves within the organization. And so that very simple exercise can serve as a litmus test for so many organizations, for so many things. When it comes to hiring, these are our values. Great. How do we live by those values and how we interact? Culture, right? How do we hire associated with these values? Standardizing hiring practices and, coming up with lists of questions, right? Some things that are very, very, very simple things to do. Now, I think what you're talking about too is, let's say someone goes through that exercise and it looks great on paper and there's this wonderful mission statement and the website looks fabulous, but then leadership isn't acting by those agreements.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's where authenticity and rather inauthenticity comes in, because fundamental to any organization is trust. And I would say particularly in healthcare, because life is on the line, health is on the line. And when you have leadership that is not walking the walk, when you have leadership that is do as I say, not as I do, when you have leadership that is saying one thing and doing another, you fundamentally lose that trust. And so I equate it to parenting in a lot of ways. Maybe it's my season of life. I have a toddler, but just like parents have to model the behaviors that they want their children to demonstrate, leaders, it is their job to model the behaviors that are A, acceptable in an organization, and B, that are demonstrative of how they want their people to behave within an organization. Because you can't, in good conscience or in good faith, say, this is how I expect you to act, but I'm above the law. I'm not held to that same standard. And that's where you start to see the cracks in the culture, as what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you distill that down into what a leader can demonstrate, it's also what they can convey. And I'm thinking here of let's just say the difference between inspiration and an inspiring leader versus motivation. And I've always thought that motivation is carrot and stick, whereas inspiration is the inexhaustible, recognition that your passion and purpose comes together, and having someone in an organization connect those two things for you.
Yeah.
But I've always thought the inspiration side is probably, when you had to, rank order what would be most effective and have the highest impact factor in leadership, that has got to be in the top 3.
Well, it almost sounds to me like you're speaking to intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, absolutely.
So how much does that motivation come within someone, or how much can a leader inspire that in somebody? And I think that's where leadership development comes in. I think that's really where communication skills come in. And, maybe this is the coach in me, but I almost want to pose a question to you and say, if you could think of the best leader you've ever worked with, how would you describe them?
Yeah, what comes to mind is always an inspiring leader who gave me the room I needed to really allow where I shined, my passion, to be fully, able to connect with the organization's mission. And that was a tremendous opportunity.
Right. So someone who tapped into your intrinsic motivation.
Right. Absolutely.
Somebody who saw you, recognized your strengths, recognized your talents, recognized what motivated you, gave you the autonomy to execute, but also enough guidance that they weren't just throwing you to the wolves.
Absolutely. And the opportunity for feedback and education and consultation, which was fantastic.
Yeah. And I actually just had an entire conversation earlier about how feedback is a gift, right? And when I think about leadership, a lot of leaders tend to abscond their responsibility, in my opinion. And what I mean by that is it is a leader's role to guide. It's a leader's role to step in when necessary. It's a leader's role to give space and allow people to learn. It's a leader's role to train, right? Or at least set up the infrastructure that allows for training. And when someone doesn't want to have the difficult conversation, or when somebody doesn't want to step in because they think, oh, I know this is going in the wrong direction, but I don't want to micromanage. There's a contextual understanding that's required of a leader to understand when and where they're needed. And so this may be a roundabout way of answering your question, but there is an element of understanding, going back to that third piece of the triad, relationships. People are unique and people are who they are. And it's incumbent on a leader to understand their people, understand what makes them tick, and tap into that somehow.
Yeah. Hopefully playing to their unique strengths,
Exactly.
Which is, I think that's when you really have that alignment and knock it out of the park.
And frankly, putting them in the right place.
Right.
Because, I mean, I'm sure you've seen this. I've certainly seen it too, where you have someone hired into a role that's just not right for them. Right. But that doesn't mean that they don't have incredibly valuable strengths. It doesn't mean that they can't add tremendous value elsewhere in the organization. And sometimes just a pivot from position A to position B allows them to shine and take off. And, oh, by the way, you just saved yourself on recruitment costs. You just saved yourself on the downtime of finding someone else. And you're inherently increasing profitability for the organization.
With someone who has some institutional knowledge, which is, the way to go.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Speaking of pivots, let me pivot a little bit and get a little bit more tactical. And this is where I want to bring it home to the healthcare side. Mm-hmm. Really, I'll even say the clinical side with respect to clinicians who are working at the bedside day in and day out. Communication is so important in that setting. We know this in healthcare. If you look at healthcare, significant adverse events, mistakes, many of them are associated with miscommunication, poor communication. And organizational success really depends upon clarity. And healthcare is one area where it's more than just organizational success, as we know. There are positives, team huddles that are out, et cetera, that we've seen this in healthcare, but there's also these areas that as I said, a high reliability organization, they're loaded propositions. One is handoffs. Mm-hmm. The other piece is the hierarchical relationships that you would see in, let's just say, hospitals. Although, and I want to be clear on this, it has changed. Clearly, it has changed over the years that I've been in healthcare. But there's always been the physician, nurse, other staff members, and now it is a very diverse team. When you look at all the clinicians that are absolutely vital and necessary for the very important provision of healthcare, there's no doubt that's it takes a team to do it. But when you have these hierarchical structures that are longstanding, how do you work around them or through them? What is your advice? What is your insight given your experience? And I would say this. I know it's no different in business. It's just, again, the stakes are perhaps different, and we could, I think, agree that they're probably higher when you're dealing with life and death situations. Completely
agreed. And there's so much in the question you just asked, so I might go a few different places, but please try and bring it all together. So I am a big believer that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of pain. And where I find that a lot of miscommunication stems from is from people not being clear, again, step one, clarity on a few things. What is the goal of this conversation? What is my desired outcome from this conversation? Who is my audience in this conversation? And what do I need to be mindful of in my delivery in this conversation? Now that varies widely. If it's a handoff, like what you just said, the goal would be that the next provider knows exactly what has been done, what needs to be done, and therefore knows a plan of action to go forward. That's a very different conversation than if a healthcare provider is delivering bad news to a family, right? And so much of it is context in that way. And I'm a very big proponent and believer in taking the 2-3 minutes to ask yourself those 4 questions saves a lot of confusion and pain going forward. So that's step one. part two of what you asked gets into politics and hierarchy, right? And, it is similar in business as it is in healthcare that these are bureaucratic organizations a lot of the time where there are expectations in terms of hierarchy. That being said, and you and I have had a conversation on this, it is a responsibility of anyone within an organization to say something when they see something. I was in New York for a long time. There was the subway, see something, say something, right? On the subway. But especially in healthcare, if you see a provider using the wrong instrument, if you see someone writing something down, it is a moral and ethical responsibility to say something and to have your voice be heard. To me, that comes down to step two, which is communication and the delivery of the information, right? Interesting fact about communication, 7% of interpersonal communication is words. 37 to 38% is tone, and 55% is body language.
Wow.
Surprising.
Very surprising. Very surprising. Yeah.
So much of the message we receive is predicated on how we deliver it, not necessarily what we say. And so it's also a matter of going back to knowing your audience and then understanding how to deliver that message in a respectful way. So if it is someone who's more senior than you in the hierarchy saying, look, I want to be respectful of the pecking order. I did notice this. Am I right in assuming X, Y, Z? Right? You've made your point. You've made your message clear, right? And that can be a scary thing, and I don't want to discount that. There is value to hierarchy in a lot of ways when it comes to chain of command, and especially, in an organization where so much training has gone into what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, like in healthcare. But your voice needs to be heard within an organization because everyone plays a very important role. And that goes back to the third piece of this triad, which is the relationships. And relationships are ultimately predicated on trust, which we had talked about before. And so the more you can be direct with someone, the more you can be respectful still of somebody, the more you will build trust with that person. And then that is net positive, not only for the relationship, but for the future working relationship, and then for the organization going forward.
So much of what we're talking about here, it's revolving around communication as a theme. I mean, it comes up. We both, I think, agree that in healthcare, it's essential, but it's also a requirement for safe patient care.
Yes.
No doubt about it. One other piece, though, particularly when I think about aspiring leaders, folks who are, whether it's in healthcare or business or any sector that's out there, your voice is so important, and having the opportunity to make sure it's heard and creating the environment so that you could be at the table. That's a vexing situation for someone who's young, any young aspiring leader. I could assume you went through that, although I hate to assume anything, but you mentioned finding your voice. What is your thoughts around the most effective way to make sure you're heard in an organization? Sometimes, and whether it's healthcare or business, very complex, dynamic, fast-moving organizations that may have very long-standing bureaucratic structures.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I love that I can beat my drum on communication here because I think my husband is sick of me doing it at home. But to your point, finding your voice in an organization can be quite difficult, particularly for more junior members of a team. What I would say first and foremost is you have to earn your voice. Now, there are different ways to earn it. It can be that you come into an organization with a lot of back history, with a lot of valuable experience, and you're hired into a position for that experience. It could be that you start off as bright-eyed and bushy-tailed out of school or from wherever you come from, and you hit the ground running and you get on-the-job training. But it's ultimately building that trust, again, going back to the T word, right? Building that trust that you know what you're talking about, building your credibility, and that you know from experience, right? one thing I will say is I do hear from a lot of people who tend to be younger. I don't want to overgeneralize. Certainly, I don't believe in that. But say, day one, I should go in and they should listen to me when they have maybe 2 months of work experience, right? So that context is really important because, there is an element of earning your stripes, rolling up your sleeves, getting your hands dirty. I can use all the tropes here that I want to use. But again, earning that credibility so that your voice has clout. That's number one. Number two is context. Really being aware of the dynamics within an organization. I don't care if it's healthcare. I don't care if it's banking. I don't care if it's a restaurant around the corner or a bar that you go to for drinks on Thursday night. There are interpersonal dynamics in every single organization and frankly, group of people. Humans are social animals. We were raised as social animals. We evolved for millions of years as social animals. Social dynamics are at the heart of all of this. So if the goal is to get a seat at the table, it's also incredibly important to understand those social dynamics. Who has the credibility? Who has the clout? Whose voice carries weight? Whose voice doesn't? Who rolls their eyes when so-and-so speaks? Who has everyone hanging on every word that they're saying?
It's getting back to the verbal, nonverbal, and the tone.
Exactly. And the reason why those things are so important in our communication is because we evolved for them to be so important in our communication. These are deep-seated biological things in the way humans talk and interact. And so understanding the context and the culture of a particular organization, how people interact, is critical. And then the last part is being a squeaky wheel. Mm-hmm. Fortunately, this was never something I had an issue with. But there is an element of knowing when you've earned your stripes, understanding the dynamics of an organization, and then asking for what you want. Because no one's going to toot your own horn unless you do it. And it's interesting. I think this comes up in a lot of conversations about women in particular. I see it with a lot of men too, that there is an element of being able to stand up and say, I'm really interested in this. How could I get more exposure? How can I get more opportunity to try this on for size? And there's a false expectation that if you work really hard, someone will recognize you. Hopefully that happens. I hope that happens for people. But people are busy. People have kids at home. People have a whole slew of things they're dealing with, sick parents, whatever it is. You're asking for a lot of their attention to go out of their way to support you. I hope there are managers out there that would still do that. But ultimately, it comes down to taking your destiny in your own hands and moving forward.
And also looking for those opportunities.
Yes.
I think I reflect upon my own career path. And I was very fortunate to have inspirational leaders as my bosses, certainly in a couple of situations that were life-changing for me. But being, as I've said many times before, fearless but not reckless in your pursuit of opportunities to add value to the organization and also advance your own career is something folks should not sit on the sideline and wait for it to come to them. Do you agree with that?
I do. I certainly agree with that. Opportunity presents itself when you least expect it. Right. And so there's an element of also being open and looking for it, right? And I love what you say, fearless, not reckless, because that brings in the context piece. That brings in the understanding the culture of an organization piece. I also don't want to discount how scary it can be to go and ask for what you want. It's a very scary thing sometimes. And I think that's when, people ask me, how do you build confidence to do something like that? This is a very esoteric question. It's different for everybody. But I do think really being clear on the goal, what you want, where you want to go, and then being able to communicate it in an effective, respectful, and authentic way is an easy way to at least dip your big toe into the pool.
Right.
And start with small little asks, right? And then they can eventually get bigger and bigger.
Such an important point, those small wins that add up. Scale, context, so important in this conversation. We both advise startups and the individuals who are part of that really talk about taking a risk and putting it out there. I would be missing an opportunity to really not ask you about your key advice, right? The pearls of wisdom that you would share with folks who are in the process or on the journey of having a great idea to that commercialization. You've been there on Wall Street. You know what it's been like, even developing your own business. That whole journey is it's just an opportunity. And I want folks to really understand that it could be incredibly rewarding if you get the help that you need to do it. What are the pearls, the insights that you would say to someone who's saying, I'm jumping in, both feet, kicking off a great idea I have? Where do they go?
So, I have so many things to say. The first thing I would say is that inevitably there's a leap of faith involved in kicking off a business or pursuing a startup. And so as much as you plan or strategize, which I am a huge fan of for many reasons, not least of all, it gives you direction, there is an element of just doing it, right? And learning by getting your hands dirty and learning by going through the process. Where I think startups and entrepreneurs sometimes fall short is in either that clarity or communication piece. You can have the best idea in the world, but if you can't make someone understand why it's the best idea in the world, you'll never get the funding you need. You'll never grow your revenue stream because you won't get the customers or clients you need.
Right? Yeah.
Exactly. Your elevator pitch,
Yep.
Right? Your hook. I call it a hook, right? If someone asks you in one sentence at a bar what you do, you should be able to say it in one quick hook, right? So you could also be the world's best salesperson, but if you're all over the place and you're not being clear in what you're saying, they're not going to know either. The analogy I use is like Waze or Google Maps on your phone, right? You put in a destination. If Waze is talking to me in German, I don't happen to speak German. This is great. There's a destination, but I have no idea where I'm going. I'm aimless. The opposite is true. If I don't put a destination into Waze, but I'm having this great conversation with Siri, what's the point? Where am I going? Right? And it's on one of those two ends that I find either startups or entrepreneurs, or frankly, even people in sales, people within organizations tend to fall short. So I would say, A, be very clear on your value proposition. B, be very clear on who your ideal customer is, who your ideal client is. Go where they are so that you can get your message to the right people. And then C, I would be very crisp in your messaging.
Great advice, really. I think there's so many fantastic ideas out there, particularly in the health sector, that are game changers. But folks don't know how to make them come to life, right? It's that journey. So I think that is very important.
Well, and you raise a really great point, which I think is endemic not only to technical businesses, but also to healthcare, where as you climb the corporate ladder, you're taking great doers who are great technically at this technical thing they do, whether it be numbers, whether it be medicine, whatever it could be, and you're putting them in positions where all of a sudden they have to deal with people. And I used to joke on Wall Street, half the time they didn't even like people. Right. And all of a sudden they had to deal with them all the time. The same is true if in a startup organization or for an entrepreneur. You could be great at the technical thing that you're doing, the technical thing that you're selling. But when you're at the helm of an organization, no matter what you do, you're a salesperson.
Right.
You're a mouthpiece. And it's incredibly important to sharpen and hone those communication skills.
It's the theme, communication. Well, listen, as we close out this episode, I always like to, end on an optimistic note. And you're just pure optimism.
Thank you.
I know that our listeners are thinking, what are your thoughts? What can you share with respect to, I think, the cumulative basket that you have right now of just great pearls, that wisdom that will get me through my day if I'm having a hard time at work, if I'm a leader, how I can communicate better, if I have a great idea that I want to take, someplace, commercialize. Let's just start with those three. I think that's enough to keep us going for a month.
We could talk all night. Well, first of all, you caught me on a good day, which is why I'm basking in optimism. Because I will say the road of entrepreneurship is very up and down, right? There are some really great days. There are some really tough days, especially like you and I coming from very big organizations that have tremendous resources. When you do it all on your own, it can be a lot and it can get to you. But ultimately it's about the reward. So the first thing I feel compelled to say is that perception is reality. Someone told me this in my very first internship. I'm pretty sure he meant it from the perspective of keep your tush in the chair, be here earlier than everyone else, stay later than everyone else. What I have come to learn is that your perception is your reality and their perception is their reality. And what I mean by that is that in business, you are inevitably working, or in healthcare, you are opposite people who see the world different than you. And in communicating a message, it is incumbent on the speaker to deliver the message in a way that the receiver can understand. You can't control what someone does with the message. You can't control how they interpret the message, but you could do everything in your power to be incredibly clear in it, right? So that's what I would say as step number one. The next thing that I'm compelled to say is that within an organization, there will inevitably, like I just said, the path of an entrepreneur is up and down. Within an organization, there will be ups and downs. Within an organization, there will be times where revenue is flowing and things are going great. There will be times when things aren't so great and cash is tight. Or in healthcare, maybe there's a pandemic that no one expected would happen, right? I mean, look how that upheaval for all of our lives. And I would say it's really important to get clear on these things during the good times, because it's a risk mitigation strategy so that when the rug gets pulled from under you, you're prepared.
It's money in the bank.
It's money in the bank. And I always say to companies, get sharp on your processes and procedures when things are good so that by time things get bad, because there will be ebbs and flows, always. You at least have these established processes, these established rules of the road, these established behaviors, because you've built that into the fabric of the organization.
Fantastic. Jaclyn, it has been, as usual, a fantastic conversation, one full of insights and obviously pearls, as I said. Can't wait to talk to you again, have you back.
I would love that.
And everyone who wants to hear more, listen and tune into your podcast, Worked Up.
Yep.
Which is on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast.
Exactly.
I know they'll be able to find you. So thank you so much, Jaclyn. It's been great.
Rick, this has been wonderful. I love every time we get together and chat, and I'm very grateful for you to have me on the show.
Thanks again.
You too.